Welcome to the Jack Westin MCAT podcast with your host, Phil Hawkins.
And Asai Calderon Muñiz.
Welcome to the next episode of the Jack Westin MCAT podcast. We are super excited to be with you guys today. We're super excited about the topic. We have a very special announcement that gets us super excited. So I would actually love to start with that announcement first because it's been on my mind. It's one of those things that it's a very proud moment. And that's that we are coming up on both our 100th episode and the 2-year anniversary of this podcast. And so we want to make it special and we want to know what special means for you guys. And so we have a Jack Westin MCAT podcast email, podcast@jackwestin.com. And we want to know what you guys want out of our 100th and 2-year anniversary podcast. And so we think it would be really fun to do an Ask Us Anything kind of podcast. And so send us your questions. We want to answer them. And we do this for you guys at the end of the day. And so that's why we want to hear back from y'all. So that's the very special announcement. I don't know how you're feeling about that, Phil.
No, yeah, I'm super excited. And this is not something just like I always want to take everything and apply it to students as well. You should be celebrating milestones. As you get to the point of like, hey, I'm wrapping up my content, right? My CAR score has gone up 3 points. Like take a moment and kind of celebrate that. And so we're trying to set a good example here by celebrating some milestones that we're reaching. So just like as I said, if you guys have any questions or ideas of like fun, exciting episodes, please email it to us. It's podcast@jackwestin.com. That'll also be in the blurb for this episode as well. But just want everyone to know that exists.
So on to today's topic. So today we're going to be talking about 2 topics that are very easy to get confused with one another, to get confused with a bunch of jargon and terminology, and that's classical and operant conditioning. And so we're diving a little bit back into psych-soc. It's been a while since we've touched base with psych-soc, and so we want to make sure that we're exposing you guys to it. At the end of the day, it is an entire section, and it's really easy to neglect it. And I'm sure you and Molly talked about not neglecting the psych-soc section. So we're doing our due diligence and making sure that we're not ignoring it. And we want to break down these different types of conditioning into a way that is memorable and sticks. And by the time you see it on test day, on the exam, they're easy points. And at the end of the day, that's our goal here today and in general with the podcast.
Yeah. And I think that there's something about conditioning that I think just is kind of high yield. I feel like it shows up often on the exam. And so I think this will be a good thing to kind of dive into. Not only is it kind of high yield, but it's also kind of useful to understand how to train yourself or train others. I don't want to say like you should be training other people, but understanding how to like train yourself to be more engaged. We're going to talk about how certain like schedules for reinforcements or punishments are better than others for getting people getting like new behaviors established. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. I feel like I'm talking about all the operant conditioning, and we should definitely talk about classical conditioning first, because this was, I believe, the first type of conditioning that was really heavily kind of studied in psychology. And so this is Pavlov. Right. Everyone knows the experiment with Pavlov's dog, but just in case you haven't seen it or you're unfamiliar, the idea is with Pavlov is he would ring a bell every time he gave his dog meat. And then eventually he could just ring the bell and his dog would start to drool, right? Like normally the dog would drool just when you gave meat, but now, like because he would always ring the bell when he did it, now he just rings the bell and the dog starts to drool. And so like somehow this dog has been trained to drool when he hears a bell, which is a weird thing kind of out of context. But that's the overall experiment here. Now, what's tricky is there are some specific terms that you need to be familiar with. And you want to think about how the MCAT's going to test like classical conditioning or conditioning overall. And so these terms are going to be your answer choices. These, so you need to be really clear what's the difference between each of these terms.
So starting us off with the terms, the first thing that we need to talk about is what was happening before Pavlov actually trained his dog. And that's going to be the response, right, that happened without any training. And so, like you mentioned, it involves giving the dog meat and the dog drooling when they were given meat. And so we call that unconditioned. That's the first term that we're going to use. And for the meat, that's going to be the stimulus. It produces some kind of result, some kind of response. And that's the second, actually, I guess that's the third term that is involved here. So we have the unconditioned stimulus and the unconditioned response. And again, this is just what happens, what is kind of innate in the dog, that biological response that happens without any training. And this is, think about kind of your gut reaction when you see something, when something happens. And so if, you hear a loud noise and you jump, that would be an example of an unconditioned stimulus and an unconditioned response. For me, that is every time that I hear a fire alarm. It is just so loud, so intense, and my heart goes out of my soul, out of my body for a moment whenever that happens. I don't know about you, but loud sounds and we do not get along.
Yeah, no, I like the idea of kind of relating this to other stuff. Like there are responses that happen just kind of naturally without us kind of putting in the effort. And all of those are unconditioned, right? These things just happen on their own. That's what the whole idea of conditioning is training. So unconditioned stuff is untrained, right? But then there's the bell and what happens there. And so because the bell is originally what we would call a neutral stimulus. It doesn't that doesn't make dogs do anything, right? Nobody's going to respond specifically to a bell where no dog is unless they've kind of learned to associate that with something. So the bell on its own is a neutral stimulus. But by presenting the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus, aka you ring the bell when you give the meat, all of a sudden the dog starts to connect those two things. And so that neutral stimulus, the bell, becomes a conditioned stimulus. So it's something that we have learned to associate. We've been conditioned in this case. And so the dog's going to start to drool when he hears the bell. And so what's interesting here is that drooling is now what we would call a conditioned response, because we've learned to drool when we've heard the bell. And this is actually something that I want to kind of take a moment and kind of think about. In all of these examples, the bell, the meat, the drooling, all of that, note that the unconditioned response is drooling and the conditioned response is also drooling. And so those always have to be the same thing, right? Yeah. As you're kind of putting those things together. So if they ever ask you a question, this is just kind of a high level MCAT strategy here. If they ever ask you a question and they're doing a backflip, what is that? And if you have an option that says the conditioned response and unconditioned response, cross them both out, because they always have to be the same thing. So if the backflip was a conditioned response, then it would also be the unconditioned response. And you can't have two true answers, so you can just immediately cross those off overall. So that's something to note, is that the responses always have to be the exact same, both the conditioned and the unconditioned. In the case of Pavlov, it's drooling in response to the meat, which is unconditioned, or in response to a bell, which is conditioned. Either way, it's still drooling is the response.
Yeah, and hopefully that makes sense, because if the goal is to train, right, it's to produce an intended response. And so you're making that association in order to produce that response. And if you're trying to get that response, it should be the same one that you're training for and training with, right? This is one of those things that it's interesting, because this happens all of the time. And we don't realize it. Think about the dog, right? The dog was not consciously thinking, oh, there is a bell, I'm going to now get food right at the end. They weren't consciously thinking that. It was sort of a subconscious association. And this happens all of the time with us. We make these connections that we don't think about, right? And so if, when we're little kids, we learn to associate the school bus coming with going to school. And so at some level, we weren't thinking about it. And eventually we came to associate it very consciously. So it's something that can happen on different levels. And I think it's just interesting to know, because we can train ourselves both actively and unconsciously using classical conditioning.
Yeah. I think about that example often with the classical conditioning. There's a town that growing up when I was in high school, every time I drove through this town, I would stop and get like fast food. And like there's something about that, like, so like the fast food, like I started to relate like my physiologic conditions, like normally fast food, like I see a McDonald's or whatever and I get hungry, right? And so it was like a weird thing that I started driving through the town, and then all of a sudden, whenever I'm in that town, I just have this urge for fast food, and it's subconscious. I'm like not even aware of it. There's something about like driving by that sign that says "Welcome to Smithville," and I'm like, all right, fast food, right? I'm like, wait, why am I associating that with this town and not any other towns that I'm driving through? And it's because I developed this classical conditioning here. There was somebody I knew growing up. One of my friends worked at that McDonald's, and so I would always stop at that one specifically. And so now that town just makes me want fast food every time I'm in that town. So maybe I should be avoiding that town in order to stay healthier.
Did you start associating your friend with fast food?
I don't know if I did, because I saw my friend a lot outside of that, right? And so in the case with like every time I was in that town, I got fast food. First, I see my friend often. So you can imagine a scenario if like Pavlov rang his bell when he gave the meat, and like you start to connect those two. But if Pavlov was just ringing this bell all the time,
yeah,
and sometimes he was ringing it as he was giving meat, then like the dog's not going to make that connection as much. So because I saw that friend in lots of contexts, like I didn't start to like solidify that relationship. It's something about that town of Smithville. Just every time I was there, I would stop. And now I crave fast food anytime I'm going through that town.
It's funny that you mentioned that, because I was visiting family and I came back to Boston, and the first thing I wanted was pad thai. I don't know why. It was just kind of that first response. And I was like, man, like I'm back. I need to get some. And it's just one of those things that I wasn't craving it when I was back home and visiting family. But the moment I landed in Boston, that was the first thought. Food is a really powerful associator, because it's something that we need, right? It's a biological necessity. And so it's really easy to make associations with food. It's that kind of primary need. Yeah,
that's actually a really astute. I was thinking the same thing. I'm like, why is it always food, right? Like, why is it always food? And that's like, there's some evolutionary pressures, right? Yeah. Like food is was incredibly important to our ancestors, because that was like the number one cause of death for like caveman, was just not enough food, right? And so, make it through the winter, that sort of thing. And so all of a sudden food became like people who are motivated by food were more likely to survive because they were getting enough food. And so we've had these like weird evolutionary pressures that food becomes a really powerful motivator. That is something like just be kind of careful with. I know that there are some people who, kind of like, oh, I'll do for every 5 MCAT questions I do, I'll get some M&Ms and like things like that. And like that actually can be a really good motivator, but it can also all of a sudden become dangerous, because obviously that's not the healthiest thing, is to be eating, 6 bags of M&Ms every day. And so do be kind of aware of that and kind of adjust that. I know that sort of thing is done a lot with children as well, as like ways to motivate. But I think we're starting to almost kind of cross into operant conditioning with like food being a reward. And so I feel like we should kind of like segue here. It's kind of an easy segue into the operant conditioning versus the classical.
There is one thing that we didn't talk about with classical conditioning that is important, and that's extinction. So if Pavlov had stopped ringing the bell when he was giving his dog the food and the meat, eventually the dog is going to lose that association between the bell and the food, right? And so that response, that conditioned response, is going to become extinct. It's going to be lost. And so that's something that is important and that is testable. And so just throwing that out there one last time before we move on to classical conditioning.
And okay, you bring that up, and all of a sudden I'm like, you know what? They're right. There is a couple of other things, and because there's also like a stimulus can become generalized is a term as well that the MCAT tests this often. So a generalized stimulus, like what that means is, like, imagine that Pavlov's dog rang or drooled every time he rang this bell. And all of a sudden, Pavlov's dog starts to relate every type of bell with food. And so he would drool when he heard the doorbell and church bells and like a phone ringing, and like, because it kind of like sounds like a bell. And so like this dog would drool for all of these different things. And so that's what we call a generalized like conditioning here, where we've kind of respond to all bells in this scenario. There's a really famous experiment that I know the AMC has asked about that is called the Little Albert experiment. And it was something very similar to Pavlov. It was this classical conditioning. And so what they did is they had this little kid, his name was Albert, and they had this little white fluffy rat. And the kid didn't automatically look at this white fluffy rat and say like, oh, danger, right? Or bad. Like the kid like thought it was kind of cute and like didn't really hate the rat. But like if you took like a bunch of like, trash can lids and banged them together and made a bunch of loud noise, the kid would start to cry, because that's like discordant, very noisy thing was difficult. And so that kid would cry in response to the banging noises. And so the noises and the crying were unconditioned stimuli and response, respectively. And the rat was just kind of a neutral stimulus. But what they did is they started to show the rat when they were banging the lids together, and they kept, every time the kid saw the rat, banging lids. And so the kid started to associate those things. And so all of a sudden the kid started to cry every time he saw this white fluffy rat. The problem in this scenario, I mean, there's a couple of problems, but one of the biggest problems was this kid developed this generalized relationship where all of a sudden anything white and fluffy would make this kid start to cry, because he just associated white and fluffy with like the rat, and like the rat, like he had associated with the banging noises. And so the kid started to cry every time he saw cotton balls or a rabbit or Santa Claus because of his white fluffy beard. And so all of a sudden this became a kind of a problematic thing for this kid, where all of a sudden he was kind of traumatized to be afraid of anything white and fluffy. So that gets brought up a lot, that experiment, both as like a great example of generalization within classical conditioning, but also bringing up like some ethical issues. And the MCAT likes to ask about ethics in psychological experiments in the psychology section. And so that's something, like both aspects of that are kind of testable, and you want to be aware of that.
Yeah, you were saying problematic. I was like, when is he going to bring up the ethics of this experiment? On the flip side of generalization, we have discrimination, right? And that's the ability to differentiate between different stimuli. So if, and actually think about it this way. So using that kind of example with the bells, I'm going to speak for myself. I will jump whenever I hear the fire alarm or just really loud bells, right? Those loud sounds, but not if I hear church bells, right? So I live actually fairly close to one, and I've started noticing now the hourly ringing of the bells, and they don't cause that same response. And so even though they are very loud sounds and in that capacity similar, I can still differentiate. And so one will produce this response, whereas the other will not. If, someone produces, if for whatever reason, lemon juice produces a response, but lime juice doesn't, that would be another example of that discrimination, right? The ability to differentiate between, or rather that the differentiation between the two, the difference between the two produce different responses.
Yeah. And that should also make sense. Like discrimination in the classical definition is treating somebody different or treating something different, right? And so discrimination with stimuli is like, I treat this bell different than that bell. So that's not generalized. That's going to be just the opposite of generalization, which is that discrimination or the ability to discriminate between those stimuli. But this takes us to operant conditioning. I feel like I've tried to move here, but like we're finally here. But operant conditioning is an incredibly powerful tool. And I think this gets used more often when trying to train people and pets and things like that than classical conditioning. This is also like operant conditioning, you need to take and just immediately tie that up with B.F. Skinner and behaviorism. They are the same thing in your mind. Like you need to like interrelate all of these. B.F. Skinner was the guy who, like, one of the founders of behaviorism, which is all about trying to produce behaviors in people or stop behaviors. And operant conditioning was the main way that he did this. So there's once again, there's some terms here and we got to be really careful. And I want to kind of pause to just emphasize everything that we've talked about before is classical conditioning. You need to draw a hard line between all of that stuff and everything what we're going to talk about next, right? So we don't talk about stimuli and responses and extinction and discrimination and conditioning, like unconditioned versus conditioned. We don't really talk about that, using those specific terms in operant conditioning. And so be very careful, because there's a lot of times on the MCAT, you'll have a passage about something and like the passage is classical conditioning and students still pick answer choices that have to do with operant conditioning. And so you need to be very, very clear on the difference between these. So hopefully I've emphasized that enough, because I know that causes a lot of trouble with students. And so I want to be really good at pulling those two things apart. So operant conditioning. So now that I've given my big warning, this is all about trying to get a behavior to happen more often or less often. And that is reinforcements and punishments, right? Like, and this is what your parents are doing, right? Like if your parents want you to get good grades, they will reinforce that. They want you to do that behavior more often. If they want you to stop like stealing from the store, like as you're a little kid and like you go into the store and like you like take the M&Ms and stick them in your pocket, right? They want to punish that. And so punishments are used to stop a behavior. Reinforcements are done to increase a behavior. And I think that those kind of make sense, but you have to be careful with these terms because it starts to get really confusing when you put all of the terms in operant conditioning together.
Yeah, the next two, I think, is what trips students up. And it's when we start pairing terms like positive and negative with punishment and reinforcement. So before we start doing any pairings, positive means you are adding something. So you are either adding something good or adding something bad, right? Negative means you are taking something away. So you are removing something good or removing something bad. So this means that if I want to get, my child to get good grades, or I want to reinforce that, right? I can reinforce it with something positive. So I can, reward them and give them something, maybe we go out for a special lunch that they really like, right? That would be a positive reinforcement. I'm making it more likely that they're going to work hard to get those good grades. But I can also get this behavior to increase by adding something negative. There we go. So that would be negative reinforcement. So I'm removing something negative. So maybe I make it so that they don't have to do chores for a week, right? They don't like doing chores. And if they don't have to do chores, they're also going to be more motivated to put in that extra work and get those good grades. So even though we're associating the word negative here and we're using the word negative, I'm still increasing the likelihood of that behavior because I am removing something negative, right? So that's going to be important when we're going through these. You can add something good or remove something bad.
I think most of the time people are pretty comfortable with like positive reinforcement and negative punishment. Those just kind of sound right. But like a positive punishment and a negative reinforcement all of a sudden start to become a little bit tricky. But I really like examples are always the best way of doing this, right? So like, let's say that you have a child who is like 6 years old and they stole from the grocery store and you want to stop that. So we're doing a punishment, right? We're not reinforcing this behavior. We're punishing this behavior. You could do that by saying, hey, you have to do a bunch of chores. I'm adding something to your life. That is a positive punishment. Or I can say, I'm taking your phone, right? Or you don't get dinner, or you don't get dessert. And so I'm taking something away. That would be a negative punishment. And so in both cases, like I'm trying to stop a behavior, but either like I'm giving you a bunch of chores, or I'm taking away the fun stuff that you like your Game Boy or whatever. And either way, yeah, that makes me, oh my gosh, I sound so old. I mean, Nintendo DS, they're taking away your Wii. And so, yeah, they take away your Super Nintendo. I might be having some like trauma in my life coming back into my life. Oh, my mom took my Game Boy. But yeah, this idea of like the punishment could be negative, but like reinforcements can also be positive or negative, right? Like if you get good grades, your parents could be like, hey, you got good grades. You don't have to do any chores this week. So that's a negative reinforcement because they're taking away the chores. You don't have to do that now, right? Or they could be like, hey, you get to go to this concert, right? I'm adding this concert to your life because you got good grades. And so that would be a positive reinforcement because they're adding something. And so I think it just really kind of like think through different examples of these. And I'm sure that there's lots of examples that have come up in people's lives going through there. But I do want to kind of pause for a moment. You got to be very, very careful with your reading here, because there can be one scenario that can be just worded slightly different and it can switch like how it's phrased. Like I could say like, oh, because you got good grades, I'm going to give you more free time in your schedule versus, oh, because you got good grades, I'm going to take away some of the chores in your schedule. Though, like, technically those are kind of the same thing, right? Like if I take away chores, you have more free time. But like if I say, like if I word it and if the AMC words it like, okay, because you did well on this, I'm going to give you more free time. That's a positive reinforcement. But if they word it like, because you did well, I'm going to take away some of your chores, that's a negative reinforcement. It's kind of the same scenario. You just have to be very, very careful with the wording of this. And so it's something that like the hairs on the back of your neck should stand up a little bit. And you should be like thinking like, okay, I need to pay very close attention to the exact words used in this question or the solutions to make sure that it matches up with the actual ideas of positive and negative.
Yeah. I think what makes it tricky is that we often associate positive with good, right? And we associate negative with bad. And so that won't necessarily be the case, right? Because if it's a negative reinforcement and I'm removing something bad, it's not something bad happening. And so we've got to separate those. One thing that I would suggest if you're still thinking about this and it's not coming as quickly is write it out. Do a 2x2 table. And on one side have negative and positive, and on the other have reinforcement and punishment. And then fill in an example for both. Something that you can do on test day if you're having to pause and you don't want to take too long is actually just write down, are they adding something? Plus, right? Are they removing something? Minus, just like the actual symbol on your wet erase board. Is it increasing the behavior? Up arrow, right? And so that's reinforcement. If it's decreasing the behavior, down arrow, punishment. And so that's kind of a quick way where you can figure out what's going on. And just make it more likely that you'll get that question correct.
Yeah. That's also just a side note. Like, I feel like that's a whole other topic of that we should probably do an episode on, of like how to use your whiteboard and how to develop a shorthand. Because I'll be honest, like I developed a shorthand for like taking notes in cars and the sciences. And I didn't realize it, but all of a sudden that became useful when I got into med school, where I'm like, oh, I know how to write like these big complex sentences, but like I can write them fast because I'm not like, instead of writing the word change, I write delta, which is the symbol for change in chemistry. And so all of a sudden I can like, okay, this changes, do that. And like, after like this delta arrow, that, and like, that makes sense to me. But yeah, so like being aware of how to use your scratch paper. We should do a whole episode on that because I don't think we've talked about that, but I think that is actually a pretty useful thing.
Yeah. So we've talked about how to train, right? So training with classical conditioning. So think stimulus, response, unconditioned, conditioned, pause. And that's also the generalization, the discrimination, and the extinction. Pause Then we talked about classical conditioning. So reinforcement, punishment, positive, negative. Now we need to think about, okay, how often do we do these things, right? And what's the strongest response that we can get, or the most lasting connection that we can get?
Yeah.
And so we have a couple of different terms, but let's start with perhaps the easiest one, and that would be something that is continuous. So I am always reinforcing, right? Or I'm always providing that connection. I think that's probably the easiest one to talk about. It gets a little bit more complex when we start adding other terms.
Yeah, that I think when people think about like operant conditioning, they just immediately go like, oh, if you want to train somebody, like I'll just do this all the time that they're doing that thing. And like,
nope.
That, I mean, maybe that would work in an ideal world, but like, if you're somebody who has a pet or somebody who has a child, like you can't keep up, right, with that. Like, unless you're the only focus of your life, and like, I am not worried about my own food or food for anyone else. I'm just watching you and punishing and reinforcing every single moment. Like, that's not realistic, right? Kind of going through that. And so as a result, like most reinforcement schedules become intermittent, where you're not doing it kind of continuously. And so there's a couple of ways that this can work out. And so like, let's go with my dog. So I have a Great Dane, Higgs, named after the Higgs boson, the particle that gives things mass, which I thought was funny because he's ginormous. But like, he is like 1, or he's not even quite 1. And it's like there are times when I'm like, come on, please just listen to me and do what I need you to do. It's hard for, like, he's got the puppy energy, but he's also 125 pounds. And so it's like, okay, let's try to get this to work. And so if I'm trying to train him to do certain things, right? Like, for example, don't get on the couch, right? Like I need a punishment for that to get him to stop that behavior. If I'm trying to teach him to sit, when I say sit, I need to reinforce that. And so, we can do positive and negative, but also kind of like focusing on like how we do this, and the scheduling is important. So let's start off with interval and ratio, because I think that makes the most sense. So let's say I wanted to stop my dog from getting on the couch. So I'm going to have to punish him, right? Let's say I even say I'm going to yell at the dog. And so you should be asking yourself, okay, is that going to be a positive punishment or a negative punishment if I yell at the dog every time or when they're on the couch, right? So you should recognize that's going to be a positive punishment because I'm adding yelling to this dog's life. And so that would be a positive punishment, right? And so now the question becomes, okay, like, how do I base when I yell? Do I do it like when he gets on the couch, or do I do it just like after he's on the couch for a while, right? Is it based on, and this is kind of tricky, is it based on the occurrence, right? Like when he got on the couch, or is it based on the amount of time something occurred? Like how long was he on the couch? So that's the difference between ratio and interval. Ratio is based on the number of times something happens. It's based on occurrences. Like how many times did he get on the couch? Interval is based on how long was he on the couch. And that's a little bit different with the scheduling going through here.
Yeah. I think the example that I've always used is little kids picking up their toys. So are you going to, reinforce and either do something positive or take away something negative? Yes. How many times they pick up their toys, or how many toys they pick up, or for how long they're picking up their toys. And so that you can start thinking about, maybe one is going to produce longer lasting results than the other. But let's go on to the next set of terms, and that's going to be fixed versus variable. So fixed can be predicted. It means that after a certain number of instances or occurrences, or after a set amount of time, I'm going to maybe reinforce, right? So I'm going to, the child knows that after a minute of cleaning, and putting away their toys, they know that they're going to get some kind of treat. Perhaps we shouldn't say treat.
Yeah.
because we said that was really strong. We don't want to build bad habits. Or maybe after a certain number of toys, they know that there's going to be some kind of reinforcement. So that would be fixed, right? It's coming after a clear amount of time. So that would be fixed interval, or a clear and set amount of occurrences or instances, and that would be fixed ratio. On the other hand, we can make it a little bit less predictable and more sporadic, and that would be variable. So variable means the first time that I reinforce can be after a minute. The second time can be after 5 minutes. The third time might be after 3 minutes. And so it's not set, right? It's going to change and is therefore variable. If I pair that with time, right, the way I just did, that would be variable interval. If, on the other hand, I decide that I want to kind of reward the child when they're actually doing the action or performing the action, but I don't want them to know when it's going to happen, that would be variable ratio. So maybe they have to pick up 20 toys and they get some kind of reward, or maybe they have to, do it the next time. They as soon as they start and they've picked up 3 toys, I'll give some kind of reward. Maybe the third time I make them wait for it, right? And so they have to do it 50 times before they get the reward. And so that would be variable ratio. So once again, we have another 2x2, right? Another 2x2 table, and you compare the amount of time, so interval or the amount of occurrences, ratio, with predictability, fixed, or unpredictability, variable.
Yeah, that's a really good example. And I actually think, like, in a lot of ways, that's better than my dog example, because it makes sense. Like, okay, like, I'm going to reward the kid after like something. And I like also that you pointed out, like, okay, it's probably not healthy to relate that to food, right? Like, oh, every 3 toys you picked up, you get candy, right? Because that's probably not a healthy way to do this, although it will probably work and be very powerful. You're just going to have to deal with some health like issues and training a little bit later. And so you're kind of pushing the problem down the road. You got a clean room, but now your kid might have unhealthier habits. But I think what's important here is, so let's say instead of like, let's stray away from the food, let's just stray of something of just like saying, good job, right? Like that is a reinforcer, right? Like that's a positive reinforcer because we're adding something to this kid's life of saying, good job. Now that, like, let's say I say good job after the kid picks up 3 toys. Every time he picks up 3 toys, I say good job. What happens here? Like, this isn't like, this is all 4 of these categories of reinforcements and punishments, positives and negatives, ratio versus interval, and fixed versus variable. And so this gets really confusing really quick. But if you stop and think about, okay, I say good job after every 3 times he picks up a toy. So that's going to be a fixed ratio. It's based on the number of times he picks up a toy, and it's always after 3. And I am giving him saying good job, right? I'm giving him something extra into his life that's good. So that's going to be a positive reinforcement. So that would be a fixed ratio positive reinforcement. And so like you kind of have to worry about kind of all of these things together. So you can see why it starts to get complicated quickly going through here. And it could also be, like you said, like after every 30 seconds, that you say good job. Every 30 seconds that they're cleaning, you say good job. So that'd be a fixed interval positive reinforcement, where it could be just after some amount of time, it randomly changes, or some amount of toys that they pick up, which is randomly changing. That would also be, mixing up the like variable interval and variable ratio respectively.
Yeah. And you can probably start figuring out that some of these will be more effective long-term versus short-term. And so thinking about, telling the child every 3 minutes, oh, good, or maybe that's not, it depends how many toys they're having to pick up. Maybe every 30 seconds, good job, right? But they know when it's coming, and it's not reliant on them actually having to pick up a certain number of toys, right? That's not going to be as lasting, because they know, oh, I could put away 1 toy, right? Or 3 toys or 4 toys in that 30-second period, and I'm still going to be told, good job. So that's not going to produce particularly lasting results. That would be good super short term, but not long term. On the other hand, if they don't know when it's coming, and it depends on them actually having to do the action multiple times, there's that element of uncertainty that makes it longer lasting. And so I think the best example that we've talked about and that makes the most sense to people is casinos and slots, right? You can sit there. It doesn't depend on how long you sit there. You could sit there 5 minutes. You could sit there 3 days just playing the slots, and you don't know when it's coming. But it doesn't just happen by the amount of time. You have to actually put in the money and play the slot machine in order for it to happen. So that means that it's variable because you don't know when it's coming, but also it's ratio because it depends on the number of times you perform the action. So that's really lasting. And that's part of why that is such a powerful scenario, association, addiction, whatever you want to call, whatever it can turn into, because it's incredibly strong. It's incredibly lasting. So fixed interval, really weak, right? Variable ratio, really strong. And so if you want to, train your child, train your puppy, it's not a matter of how often, them knowing that it's going to happen every time, but that kind of spontaneity, that unpredictability, and depending on them actually having to do it.
Yeah. Hopefully you are kind of thinking about this. I know, I think that this is actually really interesting, right? There's kind of two parts to this. I want to kind of take a minute to talk about casinos. Their goal is to get you to play more, more often. And so they want to do whatever is the best way to get that to happen, right? And so it turns out that this variable ratio is the most powerful one, and it enforces this more quickly, right, than any of the other ones. And so that's better at training you to do this thing. I actually want to kind of take a moment and do a little bit of a sidebar. I was reading a book recently about smartphones and Facebook and kind of how those things kind of interact with each other. So there's a really interesting thing at Facebook that occurred when smartphones came out. So before smartphones came out, really Facebook's main goal was to get more people to use Facebook, right? Because it was kind of spreading, and I'm showing my age here, but I remember a time when I'm I'm not allowed to be on Facebook because I'm not in college, and they opened it up and they're oh, okay, well now we can we'll encourage people to get on to Facebook. And their Facebook's goal is we need to get people to actually sign in to Facebook, right? And what happened is this actually almost perfectly timed up with the smartphone release. But about that time, they had kind of gotten everybody to be on Facebook. And so their goals changed from, we don't want to just get more people onto Facebook. We want to get people to stay on Facebook, to keep scrolling, to keep going through, to keep engaging, because Facebook gets paid by people seeing ads. And so there's two ways to increase the amount of money they were making. One is get more people to use Facebook. They got pretty much everyone at this point, though. And so now they just need to get people to stay on Facebook and keep using it for longer amounts of time. And this timed up with smartphones, where now all of a sudden people could use their smartphones instead of having to sit at a computer. And so people could kind of scroll and keep scrolling. And Facebook hired a whole bunch of people that worked in Vegas from casinos. They literally hired in people on how do we get people to keep scrolling? How do we get people to keep kind of going through this? And they found that the most powerful way was they could use algorithms to figure out what sort of stuff people liked, right? You keep interacting with this sort of information, and so we want to kind of that's the sort of stuff you like. They found that if they kept just showing you stuff that you liked, eventually people would be yeah, okay, I've seen enough, and they would set down their phone. But what was better was to sprinkle in stuff that they know you're going to like these like 4 things. We're not going to show you all 4 of those together. We're going to space them out. And we're going to kind of create this thing like, oh, you got to scroll for a bit. And then you see something that causes this dopamine release. And then it kind of dies down, kind of similar to slot machines, right? Like you play the slot machine, you get this rush, and then you got to like play a lot more and you don't get paid every time, but then you get paid again. And like, so there's something about this ability to influence behavior, which I actually like. I remember reading this and I'm like, that's almost a little bit like scary, right? The fact that like people can use conditioning and like all of this data that exists to figure out how they can manipulate audiences to like stay on an app for longer or to do different things like this. And I think that there's a lot of people who don't realize just how powerful this stuff is. There are things, I don't talk about it often, but like I do fostering stuff. And so I have a foster daughter. And I'm like seeing things, I'm like, oh, this sort of reinforcement is like that, like really stuck really well, but now it's almost creating problems later because there's such a strong connection here. And so understanding this stuff, I think, is something that honestly, I think everybody should take some time to understand. But I don't know, like this is just stuff that I've been looking into recently. I'm like, oh, this is kind of like almost scary. You can also think about this a little bit with patients, right? If you want patients to take their medications more often, if you want that, like there are things to kind of like think about with this stuff in like terms of behaviors that you want to happen more often or less often.
Yeah. And I want to pause and say that we are not condoning for you to go out and starting to try and train and manipulate people. Let's be very cautious about that. But it is something to keep in mind, right? And so be mindful of when you are putting this into play. Recognize that, there are social media is a huge example of this. And just kind of look around you and look at when it's happening and actually use those real life examples that you are experiencing as the examples that you associate with these topics. If you can do that, it will make it a lot easier for you to do well on the exam and just a greater awareness as you're moving about this wild, wild world. Mm-hmm. But we really do hope that this has helped clarify classical conditioning. Again, separating the two: classical, unconditioned versus conditioned, stimulants and response. And then separate that. We have operant conditioning, and we have 4 sets of pairings, right? Or actually, I guess 16 at that point. But we have positive versus negative, reinforcement versus punishment. We have fixed versus variable, and ratio versus interval. And those are the terms that you have to keep distinct. Find some examples in your real life. We hope that our examples have been a really great starting point, and do some practice on this.